agents were getting in trouble for it and stuff. And I know that there are workarounds, which is what Donna's going to help me out with as far as like, you know, getting something that's fully agreed to by the buyers and sellers. I think they're just trying to not put it in the purchase agreement
Yeah,
specifically.
we never, yeah,
But
once it's in their escrow, will see that and they'll flag it right away because what happens is the buyer is going to come out the last day of closing and they're going to say, what is this $1,000 fee or $300 fee or whatever? And they're like, well, you signed it. And they're like,
I
well,
didn't.
someone slipped in it. Yeah. So those are the things, but you
Yeah.
know, we look at.
Yeah, I actually bought an investment property a long time ago, and I was an agent, but I used the agent, like the listing agent, and then I didn't notice at the end. I was like, "You charged me for your TC? Like what?" Because she just slipped it in there. But all
But then
right,
the thing about the communication from the agents, right? It's like, if you don't tell them, hey, you're paying for transaction fee that manage the whole entire transaction for us to make sure we're on pace to release our contingencies, important dates, and then it's a surprise at the end, then yeah, it's going to be a point of contention, and then there's going to be lawsuits. And so I get why EXP is doing that, but it's up to the agent to really define and explain every single fee, which I like having it in the contract because you save yourself $450, but it can't be a surprise.
yeah, for sure. As long, I mean, it's like anything else. As long as you tell them. Hey, Karina and Elias, I made you both co-hosts because I'm terrible at keeping. I need to just disable this waiting room, but
Yeah, I'm on it.
if you could just keep an eye on it. Let's see, we got 23 people. I think we're pretty much good to go. All right, so contracts and forms, kind of the natural progression from where we were at to working with buyers. I feel like there was so much that we could cover in last week's class when it comes to working with buyers. So, you know, I just tried to jam as much in there as possible, but you know, you could do whole classes on strategies for writing offers and communicating with listing agents and you know, coaching your clients to write the offers. So hopefully I was able to at least sprinkle a little bit of information and advice on each topic. And, you know, there'll be lots more opportunities and we're always available one-on-one when you actually do get in those situations. But moving on, you toured some houses, you wrote an offer, or you're about to write an offer, and now you're here with these forms and you got to explain them to the buyer. So you'll see that every buyer is a little bit different as far as how much detail they want to go into as far as the forms. You'll probably have an idea by the time you get to writing an offer, you know, how much they're going to want to be walked through it, but you know, you are filling out a legal document and they're going to be signing it. So it is important that you understand it, at least at a high level, everything that they're going to be signing, because they're going to expect you to, you know, advise them of any red flags or things that are in here they should really know about. So it's important that you've gone through it. And as silly as it sounds, like sit down at some point and actually read through all of this stuff, because there's going to be things that stick out to you and that you remember. So when a buyer asks about it, it's not catching you by surprise. So, you know, you'd think that that's a standard thing. And you'd think that this is the kind of stuff they teach you in real estate licensing class, but I did learn how many square feet, 43,560 square feet. That's pretty much all I remember from licensing, but that's why you've got our training. And now we're going to get into the forms. One thing I like to do with buyers when I meet them for the first time in person or as part of the buyer's consultation is send them a sample of the contract forms. You can download it in Zip Forms just as a sample, or you can put, you know, fake address and their names in there. But I send them a PDF sample early on in the process and let them know, like, hey, you know, review this when you have time so you're familiar with it and we don't have to offer. We'll go through it together in as much detail as you want, but I wanted to get this to you as early as possible so you can start getting familiar with it, because when we're writing offers, these are the forms we're going to be filling out. That way it kind of protects you too. Like multiple times you kind of need to make sure that you're telling them to review it. You're obviously going to go through the key points in detail, but there's a lot of stuff in there. So if you haven't told them multiple times to review it and something pops up later, you know, you could be in trouble. So really put it on them, as much as advise them that you're going to go through it with them, but really put it on them to make sure they understand what they're signing to, especially with DocuSign now. Like a lot of people will just, you know, fire off a bunch of signatures on their phone and not really read what they're signing. And if you haven't thoroughly explained something and they don't get it, you could be in trouble when, you get in a sticky situation down the road and they feel like you didn't explain to them the documents that they're signing. So, as many times as you feel is appropriate, make sure you stress to them that they need to understand, even though you're going to go through it with them, they need to understand all the documents that they're signing. So just cover your butt basically when it comes to that. Before we dive into the forms, I just wanted to take this as a good time to talk about zip forms. If you haven't had a chance to, one, you should make sure you're set up on zip forms and you can log in. The first time you log into zip forms should not be the first time you need to write an offer or fill out a document. So get into zip forms, poke around, kind of play with it. Basically, it's the official software of the National Association of Realtors. And then, every state has their own library of forms. So zip forms is where you're going to get the forms that you need to facilitate a transaction. And there's a lot of tools. If once you like anything else, if you use it properly, there's a lot of tools in there that can really just make your life a little bit easier and streamline the process. So I highlighted a few of them here. Templates is one of the most basic ones. You can create templates and save the common forms they're going to be using for a transaction, and you can go ahead and autofill the information that's the same all the time. So your information, your broker's information. There's areas that if you're always working in counties where the buyer's paying title and escrow, go ahead and check those boxes that buyer paying title and escrow. We'll get to that in a little bit. So you can kind of pre-fill as much of the generic stuff as much as possible. So when you write an offer, it's just filling in those key terms that we discussed earlier this week with the buyers. And a lot of this other stuff is already in there. You can save buyers in there as contacts and have their emails in there. So with all forms going forward, or if you have to write another offer for them, instead of putting their email in again, you just pull them up as a contact and it fills it in everywhere that the buyer's name needs to be, and then the email's already in there. MLS Connect is another feature. When you start a transaction in there, if you're writing an offer, you can sync it with the MLS and put in the MLS number, and it'll pull in the parcel number, the property address, the listing broker's information. As long as that's all in there correctly in the MLS, then it'll pull it into the offer. So it'll save you a ton of time. You obviously want to double check what it imports, but it should be pretty accurate if it's coming from the MLS. And then one of the last big things is DocuSign integration. There is a free signing tool that you get with as part of being a realtor in the California Association. It's like ZipLogix or something, or digital, I don't know. But I strongly recommend going with DocuSign. It's just a more user-friendly. You can integrate it with multiple tools, including like Disclosures.io, which is cool. You're not loading 10 PDFs into DocuSign automatically. If you're getting them out of Disclosures.io, you can just log in a DocuSign through that. And when you have DocuSign linked to your ZipForms account, when you complete the forms and you have them sent out for signature, it'll just open up DocuSign in the ZipForms window. And if it's a standard car form, it will have the signature tags or initials in there where the buyers need to sign. So that saves you a ton of time. There's like 20 initials and a couple signatures on the RPA alone. So having integrated DocuSign, MLS Connect, saving contacts info in there, and then pre-filling some templates, that can make writing an offer, a 5-minute process rather than a 45-minute process once you've got it all set up. So obviously you want to go in there and practice it and do these things and play with it a little bit, like anything else. Just like we advise you to go open a lockbox when you're not with a client, so you can get the reps in. Fill out some forms, open up DocuSign, make sure that it's linked to your accounts linked, and make sure your information's correct in there. So when you're writing an offer for the first time, or the first few times, you're not getting sidetracked with technical difficulties or spending time on administrative stuff, and you can really just focus on putting together a solid, clean offer. So take advantage of all the different tools and the features that ZipForms has, because they'll make your life easier, and hopefully you're writing lots of offers. So the quicker you can do it and the more efficiently you can do it, the better. So just a few screenshots here zip forms. Again, all of you should be in here. Right here is just the transaction folders, and they'll list out. I always just name them the property address in the city, or you can do it the buyer's names, but just find a system that's the most efficient for you. This is what it looks like when you have a bunch of parties added to the transaction. So you got the buyer one, buyer two, seller, agents. When you're adding forms, you're not adding these names in every single time, or the information when they're in there as a party. Then wherever there's a spot for these people on the forms, it'll automatically get filled out. Just a little screenshot of a form in action, and a shot here of what it looks like when you pull up the form library. So you'll get to know all the little shortcuts and names for the files, but you can also just, you pull up this library window and type in, you know, one of the words. If you need to write a request for repair, you can type in repair, and it'll pop up all of the forms that have repair in the title, and you'll find the right one. But you'll get to know pretty quick the little acronyms, and usually it's pretty straightforward. And like residential purchase agreement is RPA, and seller counteroffer is SCO. So there's a big library of forms in there. There are a couple forms that you'll run into that aren't in the library that are specific to certain areas. So like the East Bay purchase agreement addendum, or things specific to certain areas. So if you need copies of those, get one and store it. So when you are filling out a document where you need that, you can load it into the transaction. Karina, anything to add at this point, or Elias, on zip forms?
I periodically post the link for accessing those forms through the association, but I think there's also a way in your zip forms library to access it from there, but I just don't know if they're the most current forms or not for the area specific purchase agreement addendums. So just, be mindful that there are, for like basically the entire East Bay, there's specific addendums that need to be submitted with every single offer that you write. And most of the time they're provided in the disclosure package, but every once in a while you'll have to find them yourself and make sure your buyer completes them. And we can talk more about that a different time.
Yeah. So we'll go. So basically this session, where contracts and forms is split up into two parts. Today, we're going to focus entirely on the RPA and just really quickly the other forms that go with it. One nice thing that Zip Forms does is it bundles like the agency forms and other basic disclosures that need to be included when you send off an RPA. So when you pull an RPA out of the form library, it already has these forms pre-attached. So we're going to go through those, and then we're going to go through the RPA like in a lot of detail, not 2 8-hour days worth of detail, but we're going to go through as much as possible and spend a little bit more time on obviously the parts that are crucial. But you should be able to, you don't want to get caught in a spot where you're asking someone to sign something that's committing them to spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they have a question about a paragraph, and you're just, you don't know. Like my first listing appointment was kind of like that. I wasn't necessarily, and I had filled out a bunch of listing agreements when I was an assistant and all that, but never had sat down with a potential seller and gone through it. And I should have been more confident that I was going to get the listing, but I wasn't expecting the seller to sign it right there. So I was like explaining the residential listing agreement and doing my best to just kind of not make it obvious that I was reading each paragraph like right before I was explaining it. But it worked out, and we got the listing and sold it. But you don't want to be in a situation where you're caught not understanding a form that you're asking somebody to sign.
Yeah. So I want to dovetail off of what you said, John. I think that everyone, if you're new and even experienced agents, like take the time to go through every single page of the residential purchase agreement so you can articulate that when you hop on a Zoom call with your clients before they sign, and really understand where key things are, where your contingency removals are, where your seller possession items are, where the additional documents are going to be added if you click a box. Like, just know this contract through and through, so when you have your clients sign this, and before they do, you can talk intelligently. Don't wing it the first time you submit an offer and hope that you're going to know where everything is. Like, read this and study this and fall asleep reading these things at night, because there's a lot of information to know, and they're looking to us to make sure that we understand, or help them understand everything that they're signing. So read it, reread it, read it again, and get super familiar with where everything is.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the first time I filled this out, I was just so nervous because I was like, couldn't sleep the night of my first offer. I'm like, what if I check the wrong box and it's going to mean that they, it's just, it seems a lot more daunting than it is when you look at this like legal looking form. But if you actually sit down and read it like out loud and just like, it's actually, and this goes for all of the forms. If you sit down and read them sentence by sentence, they're pretty easy to understand. What the box does when you check it, or what it doesn't mean, or all that. There are some where it's a little convoluted, but as silly as it sounds, like just kind of reading it a couple times really goes a long way as far as understanding what it does. So, all right, so I'm actually just going to pull up a PDF of this. I think it's going to be a little easier to go through rather than these slides. I think I've got one ready. Yeah. Okay, so this is just a downloaded PDF of what pops up when you pull in RPA into a transaction. Again, there's forms attached to it that you're going to include anyway. And this is it's nice that they do that because they haven't always had everything. So like when I learned how to write offers, I remember I had to like a little checklist of like the agency agreement and a couple the market conditions advisory and things that like you would want to include or possible representation, and you piece them together. But when they updated the contract last time, they pre-attached the forms that you're going to be using. So let's see, did that screen share go away? It did, huh? All right, now you see the screen on the form on your screen, right? Correct?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So I'm trying to get this dual monitor thing going. This is the disclosure regarding agency relationship. Basically, this is the agreement that creates the agency relationship for you and the buyer, or you and the seller. Obviously, with the RPA, it's between you and the buyer. So it's just the form that creates that official relationship when they sign it, that allows you to do certain things on their behalf, and also obligates and commits you to do other things and act a certain way. So this paragraph right here, if you're not 100% sure kind of what your duties are as an agent, this sums it up pretty well. So I'll again leave it up to you to go through this in a little bit more detail and just read it. But to summarize this form, this is the form that creates that agency relationship between the buyers and the agent, and it kind of spells out some of the basic obligations. So that's the AD form, the disclosure regarding real estate agency relationship. And then, just further detail and more definitions and all that. But this is a fair housing and discrimination advisory. This is a brand new form. It just came out like last month. Pretty straightforward and self-explanatory. It basically explains that, equal access housing for all, and that federal and state laws prohibit discrimination against protected classes and discrimination in general. So this is just sad that we have to have a form to make it clear that you can't discriminate on who you're going to help or who you're going to sell your house to or what you're going to do based on things. But that's the world we live in. This is a new disclosure. This is why we're not supposed to be writing letters anymore, because it might identify somebody as in a protected class. And but that's that advisory. This is the PRBS, the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, disclosure and consent. So one thing that's important to remember is that agency relationship, you're an agent of a broker. So your license is hung under a broker. So when they're signing an agreement with you, they're also committing themselves, they're also creating a relationship between with themselves and the broker. And there's a bunch of different brokers out there and a bunch of different agents. So what this form is educating buyers and sellers is that, I work with this broker, you're creating this relationship with this broker, but there's a possibility that other parties that are represented by the same broker might be competing for the same house, or we might be trying to sell it to, other people that are also working for the same broker. So just basically acknowledging that there's a potential that, the same broker that they have a relationship with is going to be competing with them. that's what this form does. It's pretty straightforward. And Corinne or Elias, if you feel like I'm leaving anything super significant out on any of these forms, or you have anything to add, feel free to hop in. Wire fraud and electronic funds advisory. This is one that, especially lately, I think you really need to take some time and at some point in the transaction, just hammer into your client how sketchy wire fraud is. I worked in title and escrow, as I've said a million times, and it was a few years ago, and it was when this was really kind of starting to become an issue. So obviously in the title and escrow world, wire fraud was, a huge red flag in an area that they spent a lot of time doing, but agents didn't necessarily take it really seriously because it hadn't started really, the cases of people being hit with wire fraud were fewer and farther between. And it was this thing that happened, and, you just want to be careful, but, just like anything else, stuff happens. But if you haven't heard, like, wire fraud is insanely rampant these days. And again, being on the title and escrow side of things, we really got into things in more detail. And the way that it's not like the, generic, like, hey, I'm a prince and whatever, and if you open a bank account, like, I'll deposit some money into it, or like something that's clearly a scam. Like, the people out there committing wire fraud are incredibly organized and incredibly smart, and they understand how the transactions work, and they know the timing of when to try to sneak in there and trick someone into sending money to the wrong place. They they hack into people's emails, so they're sending emails on behalf of escrow, or they'll create an email address that looks like it was official, like it looks like a realtor, but there's one little letter that's different. But unless you're looking at the email address in detail, you're not going to notice. And they'll copy an escrow officer's signature, so it looks super official. And what they do is basically just trick people into sending money to a different account. And then they just, as soon as the money hits that account, they have people in multiple locations just grab small amounts of it, so it doesn't raise a red flag. But someone can send their, $300,000 of funds to close to the wrong account, and within 10 minutes it's gone. And they get, it's just crazy. So it's happening more and more. Now I personally know people that have been involved, luckily not clients, but agent friends who've had wire fraud instances in their transactions, or people who have caught it because they had this conversation with clients about wire fraud being rampant. And, their client called them and said, hey, I got this email and they wanted to send money, but I thought you said we didn't need to send money until the end. And it's clearly a fraudster just trying to, trick them into wiring money. But unfortunately, people have lost their life savings because they fell for wire scams, because they are really good. So I want to stress it because I think that it's something you really need to stress to your clients. And usually, and having been closer to it, I probably more passionately scare people about wire fraud. And almost all of my clients these days take the time to drop off cashier's checks. People still wire too, and it's still totally fine. And title companies obviously take a lot of extra steps to make sure that you're sending it. But there's a reason that they don't, or at least they shouldn't be including you on when they send wire instructions, because most likely it's the agent's email that gets hacked. They're just, if I haven't made it clear, wire fraud is real, and you need to explain that to your client. And this form is a good opportunity to do so. At my last brokerage, we actually, as soon as we got into contract, had to send this boilerplate email, basically just explaining wire fraud and trying to scare our clients about it. And it was in the sky slope checklist. You had to take even though there was this advisory, you had to deliberately have the conversation with your client about the risk of wire fraud, because again, they could lose, it's one thing losing a $30,000 earnest money deposit. That's still terrible, but people have lost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Escrow officers have quit because they're just too scared that this has happened, or it happened to someone they know, and it's just too stressful. So really trying to just scare you all into the possibility of that, because it's very, very real. And you don't want it to happen to your clients. All right. Now we get to the real document behind all of this, the California Residential Purchase Agreement and Joint Escrow Instructions. So when we talk about writing an offer with our client, this 10-page contract, it is the offer. So it's, an offer to purchase the property, and has all of the instructions for escrow, which, you know, we'll get into more detail, but basically it's the third party that processes the transaction and can only do things when both sides agree. Like this offer serves as the contract between the buyer and seller and the instructions to the escrow company on how to process the transaction. So it's, you know, obviously a very binding legal document, and, you know, every element of it has an impact on the transaction. So we are going to dive in. I'm good. You know, we've got an hour. I'm literally going to go through for the next 45, 50 minutes and go through line by line. There is some stuff that we're just going to straight up, you know, breeze over that, you know, you should still read in more detail, but there's a lot packed in here. When I started, it was 8 pages and it became 10 pages later. And in other states, it's 3 pages. And it's, you know, there's a lot in here because there's a lot of nuances when it comes to the contractual obligations of the buyer and seller and the legality of this whole thing. So again, you really need to understand what you're asking these people to sign. So date prepared, self-explanatory, date prepared. But, you know, one thing that is important is that the purpose of it is basically to have a easily reference this document. So when you write other documents that are referring back to the RPA, it'll always have you fill in the date prepared, because that's what refers it back to this document. So, you know, if you fill out a document that refers to the RPA, but it has the wrong date prepared and doesn't match this RPA, that could be an issue. So it should be the date that you actually prepare it, not the day that it signs. Like the day that it signed, the client sign is what triggers when it's fully ratified by both parties. That's what triggers, like that's what the timelines are based off of. But you're supposed to put this date as the date you actually prepare it. So if you prepare an offer and they don't sign until 2 days later, there's no reason to go back and change this date prepared. So next line, this is an offer from, obviously you list the buyers there. If you have, you know, if it's a whole family buying or you can't fit it all in here, then there's you can use an addendum, or there's additional sign-in forms, but everybody needs to be identified in here. And one thing to note, like if you add a buyer later, or, you know, if it's a husband and they decide later that the wife needs to be on the loan and they're going to be on title, you're probably going to have to go back and have them re-sign all these forms and potentially all disclosures too. So just make sure that when you're filling this form out, you understand exactly who's party of the transaction and you have them in here as buyers. And obviously, small detail, but make sure you spell their name correctly. And also make sure that the name matches what's on their ID. So if somebody has, you know, a nickname or just, you know, doesn't go by their legal name, just double check with your clients when you're filling this offer out. Like, hey, how do your names show up on your IDs? And then that's what you should put in here as the names as buyers. So, you know, get in the habit of double checking that, because if you have them sign it under a nickname, they're going to have to go back and sign everything again, and it can be annoying. Next sections B, C, and D, identify the property. The property address is an essential part of the contract. So obviously making sure that it's correct and that you have the correct assessor's parcel number is important. Section C is the purchase price. So self-explanatory, it's the price. 1D is the close of escrow date, and it's a contractual date. So it's not like, okay, we think we're going to close around here. It's the date that you're both agreeing to close escrow. And if there's ramifications if you can't close on that date. You know, if you go past it, it can give, you know, parties the right to cancel. So, you know, make sure you're considering what you're putting in here. And like we talked about last week, typically the length of the escrow is determined by the lender. But just keep that in mind. And, you know, when you get around the holidays and stuff too, just keep in mind, like, you know, if you're doing trying to squeeze in a 17-day escrow, which is tough these days, but, you know, Thanksgiving week is part of that. Like, double check with your lender and make sure that they really can still do 17 days, even though they're going to lose a few days to weekends and holidays. So 1 day is the close of escrow date. And again, it's a contractual it's an important element of the contract. So make sure that you've thought through what it actually is. Agency disclosure, this is just referring to the first form and telling people that they should have received something explaining the agency relationship. And then this section of the form actually explains who the agents are. So on that first part, it's just explaining what the agency relationship is on that first form. I mean, on this part, it's actually confirming who those parties are. So it's going to say, you know, who the seller's brokerage is and who the buyer's brokerage is, and it's going to spell out who's obligated to who. So obviously here, you know, the seller or the who's obligated to who, and you're going to typically, when you're filling this out, you're going to be checking that you have your buyer's broker in here, and you have your name in here as the agent, and then you're representing the buyer. If you get into, if the listing agent is somebody, basically any EXP agent in the Bay Area, one thing that's important to know is when you're filling out the seller's brokerage form, like they might not be on Team Fast or whatever, but you have the same broker. So like I was saying earlier, you're creating a relationship between the buyers are creating a relationship between themselves and the broker. So even if they have a different agent than you, if you're both EXP agents, they are actually in a situation where the same broker is representing the buyer and seller. So if you're in a deal with another EXP agent in the area, you're going to be checking this, where the sellers and the buyers broker is the agent of both the buyer and seller. And you know, it's something you want to explain to your client too. Like I have a deal with the EXP agent in San Leandro right now, and I told them like, hey, you know, we have the same broker, but I've never even met these people, or, you know, I don't know them or anything, but just so you know, like we have the same broker. So that's why it's going to look like you have dual agency. Being part of a big brokerage, you're going to run into that more than smaller offices. And then potentially competing buyers and sellers. This is just explaining they should have received that PRBS form that we went over. Again, it's nice that they include these all in the zip forms, because otherwise you're piecing them together and you might miss one. So that brings us to the finance terms. Section 3 is the finance terms. Section 3A is the initial deposit. So that's going to be the earnest money deposit or initial deposit or good faith funds. You know, usually it's referred to as EMD, earnest money deposit, or initial deposit. I think we talked about this when we were talking about strong terms. Typically 3% of the purchase price, around 3% is what you would put here. That's what they can keep as liquidated damages, which we'll refer to later in the contract. But, you know, a strong deposit is considered 3% of the purchase price. One thing to note on here is it defaults to wire transfer, electronic funds transfer. So if they're going to be doing a cashier's check or a personal check, you want to spell that out on the contract. Some escrow officers are sticklers about this. So if you know, you have this just set to the default, and then your buyer walks into the office with a personal check or even a cashier's check, that escrow officer, if you get a stickler, is going to call both agents and ask like, hey, you know, it's the contract says electronic funds transfer, but they're here trying to drop off a check. That's pretty rare, but it will happen. So, you know, explain to your buyer in the beginning, you know, ask them how they're going to send it and just make sure it matches on the contract. Yeah, that's the initial deposit. Increased deposit isn't something that's all that common, at least it's in my experience, but sometimes there's situations where, okay, I'm going to put in $10,000 as soon as you accept the offer, but after we remove contingencies, I'm going to bump it up to, you know, a full 3% or whatever. So if you're going to do something like that, which again, isn't that common, this is where you would fill it out in this increased deposit area. But, you know, again, that's not that common, but you should understand it. All cash offer. This is where you check if you're going to write an all cash offer, which is always fun and exciting. One thing that's important to note with that, if you haven't included the verification of funds, so bank statements or whatever showing that they actually have the cash, when you check all cash offer, you're obligating yourself to provide that, because if you look at how the default is, then if you just check this box for an all cash offer, the default is that the proof of funds is attached. So if you don't have the proof of funds attached to an all cash offer, then you need to check this next box and then put in here when you're gonna have the funds, proof of funds delivered to the seller. Next part of finance terms is the loan. So this is where the buyer is going to show the seller how much money the buyer needs to borrow and the terms on which they're willing to borrow. It's important to note that these are contract terms. So you can't go and, if you're going to go and try and change any of this information, the seller has to agree on it. So if you're writing, conventional financing, which it defaults to, I'm going to always try to point out what things default to. But if you're putting in here, they're going to get a $600,000 loan and none of this is checked, then you're committing to a $600,000 conventionally financed loan. If you decide that, your buyer wants to use their VA benefit, or they're going to try to do FHA or any of that, you're changing the terms of the contract, and the seller needs to agree on that. So just make sure that the loan terms are accurate to what your buyer plans on doing. So you should know by now, but if not, this is a good time to confirm, like, hey, you're going to do a conventional loan, whether it's 5% down with mortgage insurance or 20% down. You just want to make sure you know the loan type, because you're going to be obligating yourself to use that on the contract. One question that comes up a lot is changing lenders. The actual specific lender is not named in the contract. So the lender you're going to use is not a term of the contract, but the type of financing and the timeline of the financing is. So you can have people that want to shop different lenders and make the call at the very end, and it doesn't, if you're going to switch from JVM to Bank of America or vice versa, you don't need to get the seller to approve that, but you do need to make sure that the new lender can perform in the same timeline. So if you've been kind of dual tracking both loans, or your buyer has been, and they're going to switch, as long as they can remove loan and appraisal on time and they can close on time, then it doesn't matter what lender they use. But if they switch lenders a few days into the deal and that lender needs a couple more days to close, before you switch lenders, you need to make sure you're changing in term of the contract. So you need to make sure with the listing agent and the seller that they understand that you because you're changing lenders, you need more time. And it's something that they could theoretically say no to, and you're stuck with that previous lender. So you feel like your buyer is going to try to do any financing stuff to really get the best deal, just make sure you're not committing them to something in the contract that could be a problem later. So you really need to understand their financing as you're filling all this stuff out. Second loan, that's less common these days, but you'll still run into it. Sometimes people do those like 80-10-10 loans where they put 10% down, they get a 80% first loan and then a 10% second loan, and it's one way to get conventional financing without having to pay mortgage insurance. So if you're doing that, then you fill all that amount in here, and this is like a little spreadsheet formula where you put in the initial deposit, you put in the first loan amount, and then it comes down to the balance, and that'll automatically calculate the balance of the down payment, and then it should equal the purchase price. So the number that's here, the section F, is should match what they ballpark without closing costs, should match the down payment amount that they're planning on doing. And if not, then you filled something out wrong, or you understood something wrong. Going back up to this loan part, I just noticed that I have this in the wrong spot, and this is on my template. But this not to exceed, it's a good best practice to have something in here. I also should have points in here, because what this is doing is saying we're committing to getting financing, but only up to a certain rate or up to certain points. Because if you say you don't have an inspection contingency and all you can back out on is the loan, and your buyer can't, it turns out that their financing is actually a hot mess and they can still get a loan, but it's going to be at 5% instead of 3.5%. They might not want that loan, but they can still technically qualify for a loan. So legally, you wouldn't be in good faith like canceling on the loan contingency, because you can still get a loan. Or say, yeah, they can get 3.5%, but they have to pay 3 points, which is, a ton of cash. If you haven't filled out here, or if you have it in the wrong spot like I do, if you haven't filled out the not to exceed and the points not to exceed, then if you get a hardballer, they can say like, no, you can't use that loan contingency to back out, because you can still qualify for a loan. So hopefully that's clear. And, basically just make sure that the number in here, the not to exceed, should be a little bit higher than kind of the going rate right now. And then usually for points, I put 1. I think I've just been fixing this along the way, or maybe putting this in here. So luckily I haven't had any financing problems. And then FHA/VA, if they're going to do that, then they check that. So biggest thing with loans is all the numbers should match up, or financing terms is all the numbers should match up, and the type of financing and the loan amounts and everything, it should match what the buyer is actually doing, because they are terms of the contract. So balance of down payment or purchase price, self-explanatory. Purchase price total, self-explanatory. All right, on to page 2. Let's see, 1114, and then first page. We gotta speed it up a little bit, but that first page has a lot packed into it. So others shouldn't take as long, because I'm just going to leave it to you to figure out yourselves and just read. But 3H, verification, down payment, and closing costs. This is self-explanatory. You want to include, typically with an offer, a standard practice, you should be including proof of funds, which is verification of down payment and closing costs. It's one thing that's nice to, when you're talking to your buyer about like, okay, we're going to write our first offer. We need to decide on these terms. And I also need a copy of bank statements showing you have the funds that we say you're going to have. And I also need your pre-approval letter, because those go with an offer. You can, as you can see here, it defaults to verification of funds just need to be provided within 3 days. But more often than not, you're going to check this box and attach it with the offer. Because if you're in a multiple offer situation and there's 6 other offers and they're all close, but you're missing your pre-approval and verification of funds, and you're telling that listing agent like, yeah, I'll get those to you like after I accept their offer. If it were me, I would, if everything else was the same, I would go with an offer that had that attached, because you don't want to accept this offer and then it turns out like, well, actually they're waiting on this money that whatever, you know what I mean? So always try to attach that with the offer. Appraisal contingency and removal. So I'm gonna take a couple minutes.
Really quickly, that's an EXP sticking point, and it's something that they will like come down on you for. So you really want to make sure you get that proof of funds in as quickly as you can within the 3 days after acceptance, if you didn't do it with your offer.
Yeah, definitely. And they actually are strict on it too as a listing agent. Like I had a listing where the buyers checked that, but they were arguing that the pre-approval letter where the lender states that they've verified all the funds qualifies as verification of funds. That's probably a gray area, but EXP called out that I didn't have verification of funds from the buyer's offer. So get it as soon as possible, but I always recommend including with the offer. It just makes the offer cleaner and stronger, and we're always trying to write strong, clean offers. So appraisal contingency removal. This is where you're going to put in how long of appraisal contingency you need. By default, it is contingent on appraisal, and you have 17 days. So typically you're going to shorten this. 17 days is pretty long. And what the appraisal contingency is the bank is only going to cover up to the appraised value of the loan. They don't want to loan someone $650,000 for a house that an appraiser says is only worth $500,000. So the appraisal contingency there is there in the event to protect your buyer if the appraisal comes in below the purchase price. Because if they don't have that appraisal contingency and there's a gap between the appraised price and the purchase price, they're still on the hook to pay the purchase price. With the appraisal contingency, if it comes in low, there's a few different things that could happen. One ideal situation, the seller comes down to the appraised price. That's going to be a battle, but it's one of the potential outcomes. 2, the buyer comes up with the cash to make up the difference between the appraisal contingency or the appraised price and the purchase price. That's typically the scenario that you want to be prepared for if you're going to waive this appraisal contingency. Or 3, it's a point of negotiation, and the buyer and the seller, maybe they split the difference, maybe whatever. The third option is it's somehow negotiated where a new purchase price is settled on, and you move on. And if none of those things work out, then the last option is that the buyer cancels under the appraisal contingency. So if you have an appraisal contingency, it appraises for $50,000 below list price, or even $10,000. If the buyer's stretched to the max and is already getting gift funds and everything, and they can't make up that $10,000 shortfall, then they have to cancel because they're on the hook to pay. So really, especially these days, people are waiving contingencies left and right. And if you saw Kevin Bowie's post earlier, it's like every other offer in this situation had contingencies removed. There was 9 offers, I think, and 7 of the 9 offers had no contingencies. So, unfortunately for buyers, it's just the nature of the market we're in. But just because it's what it might take to win doesn't mean they should remove contingencies if they don't fully understand and are prepared for the risk of the situation could put them in. So if you ever have a question on appraisal contingency and you're thinking about removing it and you're not 100% sure that you've explained it to your buyers correctly, talk to your lender and call me or Karina or Elias, and we'll make sure and talk through the situation, whether you are or are not in a situation where it's okay to remove it. But this is where you would put it and how long it is. So typically, if you're waiving it, you would check not. If you're shortening it, which you usually should be, you would put in the amount of days here. All right, loan terms. So loan application, this is just saying that you're gonna, same as proof of funds. If it's not attached already, you're going to include the pre-approval letter with the offer. If you have it, which you should, you're gonna check this box and you're gonna attach it to the letter. Loan contingency. So that goes along with the, all the financing contingencies. Appraisal and loan contingency kind of go together. You can't get full loan approval without an appraisal. So even lenders that can do, pretty thorough underwriting on files before, technically they can't do full approval without an appraisal. So usually they're tied together, and, they're usually the same length. Some lenders want, if you have if they're telling you they need 10 days for appraisal, and they might want 12 days for loan because they need to get that appraisal and then they need to slam it through for full loan approval. Good lenders, and we'll talk about this when we talk more about financing, really good lenders should be able to confidently approve buyers up to a point where they're comfortable removing loan contingencies. So if a buyer's a pretty straightforward situations, they have all their documentation, they have sound assets and income and everything, a lender should be able to run through the whole process of approving it like they would do if an offer is accepted, and tell you, barring some disaster, as long as the buyer's been forthcoming with us and all of this is accurate, there's no reason that we see any finance issues. And while we don't actually have full loan approval, it's just a formality at this point. So when you hear people waiving loan contingencies, it's because their lender has basically taken the file and as far as they possibly can, and haven't seen any issues. So when you're removing that, you're only removing the loan contingency if the lender is, expressly told you it's okay. And I don't know if it matters or whatever, but I always get lenders to put in writing either in a text or email, like, okay, it's okay to remove loan contingency, because if, it's never happened, but if I remove it and then there's a problem, I want to be able to go back and say like, hey, like I only did this because you were confident doing it. And it kind of puts them on the hook too with the buyers, because you should never be making that decision. It's the lender's decision. I had one recently where we probably could have waived loan and appraisal, but we didn't. We got countered to remove loan and appraisal. So before we signed the counter, I called my lender, and this goes with the importance of having lender partners that you have a really good relationship with. I called my lender and I said, hey, I need to respond to this counter. We're going to remove loan contingencies. Can you make sure we're okay to do that? So she jumped on it, because sometimes they'll know off the top of their head, like, yeah, that file's solid, they're good to go. This one, like he had some tricky student loans, and she just wanted to make sure that the underwriter was going to look at the student loan calculation the same way she did. So she said, I'll get back to you in 30 minutes, went to an underwriter, ran through the whole file with her to make sure that she understood it the same way an underwriter would. And that underwriter said, yeah, no problem. And then she called me back and said, okay, you're good to remove loan contingency. And she made sure that that file was assigned to that same underwriter that already reviewed it, because underwriting is like a scary, dark world that I don't fully understand, but that could have gone to some other underwriter that looked at it differently and, you know, didn't like how she calculated student loans and didn't want to approve that loan. So moral of the story is only remove loan contingencies if your lender tells you it's okay. And same goes with appraisal. Only remove them if you have confirmed, and you've confirmed with the lender that their backup plan for covering appraisal is okay. Because sometimes they might be in a loan where they have to have a certain amount of reserve funds. And if they're thinking like, yeah, I'll just pull this 30 grand out of my savings to cover that appraisal, that might screw up their loan approval. And now they have a different loan that they don't want because they don't have the reserves that qualified them for the loan that they got. So anytime you're doing anything aggressive with loan and appraisal contingencies, talk to your lender. All right. Lender limits on buyer's credits. Oh, no loan contingency. You check this box if you're removing it. You know, for better or worse, we're checking that box a lot these days. Lender limits on buyer credits. Exactly what it sounds like. That you can get credits, but only up to a certain amount. If the credits are going to exceed what a lender is okay with, typically it's some lenders it's only a certain types of closing costs that they'll apply credit towards. So if you're looking at a potentially big credit, talk to your lender, because if it exceeds the lender limit, then you're going to need to do a price reduction instead. Buyer stated financing. This is basically just saying that, you know, everyone involved in the transaction is acting in good faith that the buyer is, you know, able to do everything that they say they can do. So if you're saying that you have all cash, or you're saying that you have, you know, X amount for down payment, if you're changing those terms, it could be grounds for cancellation. So that's what buyer stated financing kind of explains. Sale of buyer's property. You would check. Default obviously is that the buyer does not have a property that they need to sell before they can close on this purchase. If they do, you should have known that by now, and you're checking this box, and you have to attach the form COP for it that explains that contingency. We'll go through that form next week. It's a really tricky form. I have, for better or worse, a ton of experience with it. I had a lot of contingent deals the last couple of years, and there a lot of people, because it doesn't come up often, don't necessarily understand how that form is written. And that's a form where you can check or not check a box that could really make a big difference to where the situation your client's in down the road. So for now, just know that if they have a property to sell, you're checking this box. And if you need help with the COP, you know, call me or Karina. Like it's a tricky form. Addenda and advisories, this is just saying if there's any additional documents that are added to this form, you're going to check it. This one's checked because it pre-attaches the form to the offer. But, you know, if it's a trust sale or probate or the short sale, you're just checking these to attach it. One nice thing, talking about, you know, how zip forms is super helpful. If you check this box, it automatically pulls that COP form into the file, so you don't forget it. Or if you check that you're removing contingencies with the offer, it pulls in this contingency removal form to the file. So, you know, it's the little things that we get excited about, but it's nice that a nice feature that it does that. Allocation of costs. This is where it's going to spell out who pays for what. Typically, the seller is going to pay for the natural hazard disclosure report. This is something that, like, in your template, I should have this too, that you check the seller, because they're almost always going to pay for it. And then prepared by you know, if it's already in the disclosure package, look up who they have it from and put there. A lot of times people will put seller's choice, and I still do, but it's on offer instructions, somebody told me that seller's choice is actually an NHD company. And if you put seller's choice in there, then you're obligated to use seller's choice. Obviously, that NHD company is smart and tricky, but this part, you know, obviously self-explanatory. This is if if you're gonna obligate them to pay for any additional reports. Typically, these are gonna be blank, but if there's some special circumstance, government requirements, typically seller is gonna pay for.
Right on that, you don't
Yep.
ever want to put in home inspection, roof inspection, pest inspection, any of those reports, because then they become part of this purchase contract and the lender is entitled to see them, and that can kill your deal. So
Yes.
try
Yeah,
to
great
avoid
point.
putting any extra reports in there, unless it's an all cash deal, maybe that's a way to go. But if there's a lender, you don't want to.
Yeah, and that's something that actually, thank you, Karina, because that's something that, you know, should be hammered in to this whole thing is nothing on the contract should ever reference any kind of reports or any kind of repairs, because it makes them part of this whole thing and the lender can see it. And if they know that there's, you know, it needs a roof, or if they know that there's $20,000 of dry rot, that can kill your deal. So there should never be any reference to it. So if for some reason you need to incorporate something onto the deal that's going to refer to that, then one, try to word it in a way where it's not, you know, if someone's crediting $5,000 because there's, you know, a major roof repair, it's a $5,000 credit towards closing costs, not because of the roof repair. So, you know, that's fine. But if you say $5,000 credit towards roof repair, like that's a huge red flag. The lender not going to do it in the first place, and they're going to ask for the report, and it's just going to be trouble down the road. So never refer to any kind of repair or report, because it can raise red flags with the lender and potentially just wreck everything. Government requirements. Normally this box is checked. Seller is going to pay for the smoke alarm and carbon monoxide detectors and water heater bracing. This should be checked too. Like, this is something you can check on your template. This normally is left blank. It's, if you check seller is going to pay for the cost of compliance of other minimum inspections, then normally if there's anything that, you know, is normal and is part of the transaction, you're going to include like sewer lateral or sidewalk or whatever. And that's incorporated. But if you just kind of check this box and there's some random thing that comes up, having this box checked puts the seller on the hook to pay for that. So normally we leave all the stuff blank unless there's some specific thing, and normally that's spelled out in a different way. Escrow and title. This is going to talk about who pays for what as far as escrow and title. In most of the areas around here, it's a buyer paid county. They're buyer paid counties. So the buyer pays escrow fees and the buyer pays title fees. And here's where you put in the escrow company. If there's a pre-sale escrow and, you know, it's a competitive situation, usually you're going to go with the pre-sale escrow. If it's not, you know, use the escrow officer that you like working with. I could go on, and I will at some point, about the importance of having good partnerships with title and escrow people. But this, for the purposes of contract, this is the section that puts in who's paying for escrow and who's paying for title. In most places, it's the buyer. I do think it's the South Bay. I think some counties, like Santa Clara County, I think it's actually split. Can anyone confirm that? I think what's customary in Santa Clara is that the buyer and seller split title and escrow. Anyone know for sure? We can confirm that, and title companies can confirm that too. But basically, these are there's customary things in each area. And if it's split, then you'd check buyer and seller, and you would put buyer seller 50-50 split. Other costs, county transfer tax, almost always put on the seller. If you want to get fancy and try to make your offer sweeter, the buyer can pay for it, but it's, they should already be planning on paying for it. So unless you're really trying to pull out all the stops, the seller should pay county transfer tax. City transfer tax, buyer and seller should both, typically buyer and seller split it. So the way it should be written is you check both boxes and then you wrote buyer/seller 50, buyer/seller 50/50 split. If you just write in buyer/seller split, just remember this is a legal document, so it needs to be as detailed as possible. If you just write they split, like you could split it 80-20 or 60-40, and it would be split. So you specifically want to say buyer/seller 50-50 split. Seller, or this is going to pay, who's paying for the transfer fee. Usually sellers try to put it on the buyer. So, check buyer or check seller if you want to try to sneak it in there. This what came up in Slack the other day. So the contract actually defaults to the seller paying for HOA docs. It's if you don't check anything, the seller's obligated to pay for HOA docs. What a lot of people think is that this section right here is who's paying for HOA docs, but this is actually for who's paying for any additional HOA docs other than those required by civil code. So unless there's some weird situation, the documents required by civil code are the standard HOA documents. So normally you would just leave this, blank, unless you know for sure that there's some special document, and then you would see who's going to pay for it. Somebody was in a situation recently where the listing agent like countered out or wanted to remove the seller from this because it, like the other things, having that check will put the seller on the hook to pay for it. Buyers, sellers pay for any private transfer fee. That's, if it's specific to the deal. Here's where you would put any just additional things. Again, don't put anything that sounds like it's related to a repair or a port in here, because the agent's going to see that. And then here's the home warranty. What's customary is that a seller pays for the home warranty, and I always ask for an upgraded home warranty and to include air conditioner, pool, or spa. Like, I don't have this in my template because I don't want to check air conditioner if there's not air conditioning, like if it's an open or whatever. But you're asking them. Home warranty, you should have a good home warranty rep partner. Again, goes a really long way in the service you can provide your clients. I sold a home, the pool equipment blew up 2 weeks after they bought it. They called the home warranty. Home warranty said, "You just got it. Like, sorry, we're not covering it." I called my home warranty rep and they covered it. So there's value in having a good relationship with a home warranty rep, because they're going to be able to do you favors. It's literally their job to, make sure agents are happy. So use the home warranty company that, takes care of you.
Another sticking point for EXP is to always specify who that is. Some people put seller's choice, but it's always best to put the actual title company so you don't have to fix it with an amendment after.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Like it's you never want to, like, you can always go back and clean stuff up, but it's just a hassle and people have to sign stuff, and it just makes you look a little less organized. So have as much accurate detail as you can in the beginning, because it's just going to make your life easier.
John, really quick, I put the who pays what document in the chat room.
Right.
So everyone everyone grab that document, because you're going to be using it on this section C and D. You're going to be using that. So use that, know that, and have that as a reference point. Cities are different, cities are different. So make sure that you have that. And you can also use that in your seller net sheet when you're creating that for a listing presentation. So make sure you download that document. There's many versions of it, but the document is called Who Pays What, and it's in the chat room.
And it's just what's customary. These are all technically negotiable, but you want to look like a professional that knows the area that you're servicing. So you want to follow what's customary, like I said, from that document, from title companies. There's lots of different ways to find the information if you're in a pinch, but this looks like a really good one. Thanks.
Yeah. And just again, it's what's customary, it's not required. And if you really want to, you can try to change that to make your offer sweeter. But I always unless you're really trying to stand out, I always they're planning on paying for it anyway, just ask for it. Worst case, they counter it out. Home warranty is one sometimes where, if you're going to leave one out to try to get the seller a little bit more money, you'll often leave home warranty out. Usually if you end up doing that, then like I'll buy the home warranty for a buyer. You want them to have one. In some offices, when I was at Keller Williams, when I started, basically you were kind of required that your insurance was cheaper if your buyers always got a home warranty. So, I don't think it was actually required, but you were strongly advised if the seller doesn't buy a home warranty, then you should buy them a home warranty. And one thing too, on just being professional, don't check boxes for stuff that doesn't apply. So if you're writing an offer in Walnut Creek, there's no city transfer tax. So don't have city transfer tax filled out, because it's just going to make you, it's going to potentially make you look a little less professional and organized, because you have all these random boxes checked that don't apply. So when we talk about a clean offer, like that's an example of writing a clean offer, like not having things checked that don't apply. Don't ask for air conditioner coverage on the home warranty if there's not an air conditioner in the house. So, be a stickler for detail on these offers, because not only are you potentially obligating parties to certain things, it's also just one way of showing, how clean that your presentation is. So don't check boxes that don't apply. Buyer waives purchase of home warranty. Obviously, you can waive it. Nothing. If you waive it, you're just not asking for one. Buyer can still buy one later. Items included in the sale. This is pretty straightforward. I'm going to start to kind of pick it up just so we can make sure we cover all the important stuff. But if there's a stove, fridge, washer, dryer, check these boxes. If they, I always ask, and unless the client specifically says like, I don't want that gross washer and dryer, then don't check it, because then they're stuck with it. But if they don't check it, then the seller needs to take it out. But normally stove, fridge, washer, dryer, if they're there, you would check and you would ask for, if they counter it out, they counter it out. But I always try to ask. This explained leased or liened items. This is something that was like added in the last version because solar systems or alarm systems. It just talks about how they're incorporated in the contract. And typically it's not, if the seller has a leased item in there, the buyer is not obligated to take it unless it's prearranged for. And if it's something like a solar system where they can't just easily break the lease, then you're going to negotiate that they're taking over for it, because them having to pay cancellation fees is going to be part of the deal for it. But that's what this section talks about. Items excluded from the sale. That'll be something that comes up in a super specific situation. There's this new little section basically saying that like if there's brackets for the TV or whatever, they're going to either remain with the property, or you check that and ask them like, hey, like if you notice that there's a huge TV hanging, and the sellers are going to take it, then you want to check this box, and that basically obligates them to make sure that they repair those holes, and your buyer doesn't show up to their new house and there's some giant sections of sheetrock missing. Closing and possession, pretty straightforward. Buyer intends to or does not intend to occupy the property as a buyer's primary residence. Seller occupied or vacant property. This is talking about when possession is going to be delivered to the buyer. So, when you read through these, when you read them to yourself, that's how you figure out what it defaults to. So possession shall be delivered to buyer at 6 p.m. and that's if you check these, then it's the or applies on the date of close of escrow, or check no later than calendar days after the close of escrow. I have one where the buyer wants till the last possible second. So they have, 11:59 p.m. filled out here. So basically like we don't get keys until the day after they close. But if that's a situation that you want, make sure you fill it out correctly. Seller in possession after close of escrow. This is the section you'd fill out if the seller is doing a rent back. There's some nuances to rent back, so make sure you understand. But basically, if it's under 30 days, then you use a SIP form. You check this box, it pulls it in. If it's over 30 days, then you use the residential lease after sale form. So you want that rent back to be as short as possible, because lenders don't like rent backs. Because it essentially creates a tenant agreement. The reason that there's different forms is because if it's under 30 days, then they don't necessarily have the same rights as a tenant. It's just a seller in possession. But since if they're going to stay there over 30 days, then it's a lease after sale. So, right now there could potentially be, you have someone with a 60-day rent back, and then they don't want to leave, and there's an a moratorium on evictions, like they have case to stay there. And lenders typically won't allow rent backs over 60 days anyway. So if you're working on something like that, you have to kind of backdoor that in, because if it's incorporated in the contract that the seller is going to be there longer than 60 days, that lender is basically going to look at that as a non-owner occupied property and as an investment property. So that's just something to be aware of. Tenant occupied property, pretty self-explanatory. Tenant to remain in possession, obviously you'd know that. These are things that, like, if you're writing an offer on a tenant occupied property, and that the tenant's supposed to say, like, you should be checking this, because that's telling the listing agent, like, we're expecting the tenant to stay. So they, if that's a term that they wanted, that should be checked. All of this stuff is pretty self-explanatory. Like, we're coming up short on time. So I just go ahead and, read through these things. It just talks about all the different disclosures. The main thing to get from this is that there are statutory disclosures that the seller is required to provide to the buyer. And this talks about it in more detail, but the main ones, there's a few random ones, lead-based paint and, NHD, but super important are the transfer disclosure statement and the seller property questionnaire. Those are 3-page forms where the seller is answering questions to their best of their knowledge about the property. And those are pretty crucial forms. Like if those forms are missing, you know, the buyer can cancel potentially if they get information later. You know, there's a lot of nuances to that too. But this whole section is basically explaining that they're obligated to receive certain disclosures from the seller. Withholding taxes. This can be confusing, but basically the seller needs to prove to the buyer that they're a resident of this country, because if not, that the buyer is actually on the hook for withholding money for property taxes. You're rarely going to deal with this, but it's important to understand it in case you get questions. But there's a form that the seller will provide. It's called the FERPTA, or if the FERPTA asks for a social security number, so sometimes they use a form called the qualified substitute. That's just the form that shows the seller there. If the seller can prove to the buyer that they're a permanent resident or a U.S. citizen, then the buyer is not obligated to withhold funds. You're rarely going to have to deal with that, but if you do get in some weird situation, you know, talk to your title.
It's something that title will be on the lookout for too. So
yeah,
you're not alone on that.
Yeah, and it's the kind of thing where if you get really specific questions about it, defer to the escrow officer, because they're gonna explain it 100 times better than you will. So, you know, you should know what it is, and that you should be able to say like, oh, it's because of this. I'll put you in contact with the escrow officer because they can answer it in more detail. Notice regarding gas and hazardous liquid transmission pipelines, pretty straightforward. It's just telling people there's resources if they want to find out if there's a pipeline that might explode under their house. Condominium plan development. This is saying that if it is part of a condo or plan development and subject to, you know, the stuff associated with that, the seller has 7 days after acceptance to disclose to the buyer if it is. Normally, Normally you'd think that would be done up front, but I actually had one where we didn't realize the property was an HOA. Nobody knew until the property was an HOA until we were in contract and it came up on the prelim. But the seller, you know, is obligated within a certain amount of time to tell the buyer if it is. This is just talking about HOA documents and you know what they're entitled to. Condition of property. So this is important to read because it'll help you understand how you explain, you know, what the seller's obligation are as far as the condition of property. But basically it also explains that, you know, right here, property is sold as is in its present physical condition. All sales are as is. It's silly when listing agents talk about as is. That's basically just saying like, hey, don't try to ask for repairs or credits. But even if they do that, I've gotten repairs or credits on properties that were sold, you know, theoretically as is. Every sale is as is. The seller's not obligated to fix anything. They're obligated to disclose anything that's material about the value of the property or any defects in the property, but they're not obligated to fix anything. And you will have buyers that think because this stuff shows up on an inspection report that the seller is obligated to fix it. So, you know, if you get the feeling that they think the seller is supposed to be responsible for certain things, point them at this section of the contract or just explain to them like the seller's not obligated to make any repairs or anything. They're just obligated. You know, if there's a leaky sink, they don't need to fix the leaky sink. They just need to tell you there's a leaky sink. So this next section talks about the buyer's investigation and their rights to do their due diligence. Read this. It's you know, it's important you understand in detail, but it's pretty straightforward. Title investing. This is just talking about you know, everything that goes along with how they're going to take title. It talks about the preliminary title report, which is we'll go through that when we get to title and escrow, but it's a report that title issues spelling out any any liens on the property, anything that runs with the title. So whether it's an easement or a lien on the property, that'll be on the title report. The title company's job and what they're insuring. Title insurance is kind of ridiculous racket, but you know, we'll leave that for another day. But the title company's job is to make sure that the party selling you the property is entitled to sell you that property, and two, is going to transfer you that property free and clear of any encumbrances. Encumbrances is one of those things that you actually learned about in licensing school, so you should understand what those are. But you can explain to your buyers that you're paying a title company because they're going to make sure that it's free and clear of any liens, including obviously the obvious ones like mortgage and things like that, or tax liens or anything else. They're going to make sure that those are all cleared before the seller transfers the property. And then they're going to ensure the fact that they transferred you a property with a free and clear title. So if somebody came up and said, hey, this person had a mortgage or a second loan, or I put a mechanics lien on this property, then they go back and theoretically use their title insurance, and that protects them from those people that are saying they have claims on their property. So that's what this is. Time periods, removal of contingencies, cancellation rights. This just talks about how they can only be extended if there's an agreement. So, and also with contingencies, they need to be removed in writing. So if you have a 10-day inspection contingency, on day 10, in the morning of day 11, it's not like that automatically just expires. Those contingencies remain in effect until they're removed in writing. And that's what this part is explaining. So it's important for your buyers to understand that. And then if once somebody's passed like the seller doesn't have a lot of right to cancel the agreement, but once the buyers breach the contract and are not perform something that they're obligated to do, then the seller can potentially cancel. So once the buyers passed a contractual timeline, the seller has to give the buyer one last chance and issue what's called a notice to perform, which is typically 2 days. So it's, day 11 shows up, you haven't removed your contingencies. The seller can then issue a notice to perform saying 2 days. Some listing agents that are, maybe they have reasons to do this, maybe they just do it because they're jerks, will issue notice to performs like a day or two before contingencies are due. So then that way, like if you don't do it, then on the day that you pass that they can cancel. But the main thing to take away is that, time periods can be extended, but only on agreement, and that contingencies need to be removed in writing. And before the seller can cancel because you didn't do something you're obligated to do, they have to issue a notice to perform.
And that those days can't expire on a weekend or a holiday. So just so you have 17 days for your inspections. It falls on a Saturday, it rolls to Monday. It falls on a Sunday, it rolls to Monday. So just keep that in mind. And there's definitions of what days are a little further in the contract, but they don't expire on the weekends.
Yeah, and that's important to know. And sometimes you can think about that, like, you're trying to write a short inspection contingency and you're submitting offers on, they're going to review them on a Monday afternoon. If a 5-day inspection contingency on an offer that's accepted on Monday afternoon, you get a couple extra days because it falls on a weekend. So just know that like those time periods can't end on weekends or holidays, like Karina said. This is talking about seller has 7 by default, or you can shorten this days after acceptance to deliver buyer all the reports and disclosures that they're obligated to. And then the next one is this is the inspection contingency. So when you talk about the length of the inspection contingency, that's whatever you put in here. So by default, it's 17 days. Tough to get an offer accepted with a 17-day contingency in this market. So normally you're going to shorten that. But this all talks about the inspection contingency and all that goes along with it. Typically, these days a lot of stuff is provided up front. But normally, if you're going to shorten this, then if you're going to shorten the inspection contingency, then you want to shorten how long the seller has. Because if you're going to give yourself a 5-day contingency, you want to shorten that seller obligation to deliver all the documents to say 2 or 3 days, because you don't want to get stuff after you've removed contingencies. That's something that you'll hear about, like there's loopholes, and if you get documents after contingency removed, it opens up a new contingency window. We talked a lot about that in that 8-day class or 8-hour 2-day class. And yes, there is some truth to it. Like if they're missing the SPQ and you remove your inspection contingency, then they deliver the SPQ, then yeah, chances are you have the right to cancel, even though you removed your inspection contingency, because you got new disclosures and that opened up a new window. There's a lot of nuance to that, and some people think, and you'll hear different things, like if there's a question that's not answered on the SPQ and you remove the inspection contingency, and then they have to go and answer that question, that revises disclosure and opens that cancellation window. That you would just, you never want to be in a situation where you're like have that in your back pocket, because that's something that can be argued, like in, if it gets to court or whatever, that's something that can be argued, like, if it's some totally irrelevant detail and you specifically removed your contingency, like yes, it's a new disclosure, but it shouldn't be grounds to cancel. But you know, I'm getting a little bit more like advanced. But if you ever hear about like those loopholes with once you remove your inspection contingencies, like make sure you really understand how it all works, because you don't want to think you have a right to cancel when you really don't.
The big one would be the seller's seller's agent avid, not the buyer's agent avid, not your avid, but the listing agents sometimes get a little sloppy. They're moving too fast. They don't get their avids done in time. And they've kind of given that buyer a new disclosure because something that they mention on that agent visual inspection could affect the buyer. And they could say, oh no, I don't want it now that you mentioned that there's a loud dog that you heard when you were doing your inspection. So
Yeah.
that's kind of like the loophole, but
Yeah,
you don't want to rely upon that, but it does exist in special circumstances.
totally. And that's a clear one too, like the SPQ TDS, because the Avid is technically part of the TDS or SPQ or something. So those are some big ones that if they get delivered late, it can very well open that cancellation window again. This just talks about the effects of contingencies. Here's the seller right to cancel. I already jumped ahead and kind of talked about this and how, you know, the seller can only cancel after delivering a notice to perform after the buyer has not met some contractual obligation. Buyers have a lot more protection, as they should, in the situation than the seller does, but the seller can still cancel. And that's why, you know, you might find yourself in a situation where the day after you got your offer accepted, they got an offer for $20,000 more, or a 10-day cash offer for the same price. In that situation, they're looking for, you know, they have a higher offer, they're looking for a reason to cancel on you. So if you know that you're in a situation like that, you want to make sure that you're following all of the obligations, because if you give them the ability to cancel and they have a better backup offer, then they're going to try to cancel on you. So it's important you understand like the mechanics of how all that works. This talks about the effect of removing contingencies. Pretty straightforward. We're going to get to the liquidated damages in a little bit. Close of escrow. Self-explanatory. Effect of cancellation on deposits. You can read through that. Final verification of condition. It's just saying that you have the buyer has a right to make a final verification. It's in here is bold. It's not as a contingent sale, but it's basically to confirm that, you know, the property is in the condition that they're obligated to provide it in. Usually it's like if to verify that repairs are done or that they didn't do a bunch of damage when they moved out, but there's no real like teeth to that walkthrough. So just make sure your buyer understands that, you know, if they notice something that they didn't notice when they walked through before, chances are it doesn't really give them ability to do anything, because at that point in the transaction, it's pretty much a done deal.
The teeth there is you as an agent can fight back and delay close of escrow until that is taken care of. If it's something, you know, egregious, not just a petty little thing,
Yeah.
you know, the lawn wasn't mowed or whatever, but like, you know, you do have a little bit as a buyer's agent to protect that. And it is an EXP sticking point. They require that we do these verification of property condition forms.
Yep. And yeah, and because it's like, because the way that things are written, you know, if a contingency is removed in conjunction with a request for repair with a seller that says they're going to do something and that wasn't done, then, you know, all the documents that were associated with that document could potentially not be valid. So yeah, you find out that this repair that they said they were going to do wasn't done in the walkthrough, then, you know, you can go back and fight for it, and you have grounds to fight for it. But yeah, if the lawn's not mowed, you know, do what Jason Ellis did and go ask the neighbor for a lawnmower and mow it yourself. This just talks about repairs and what the seller's obligated to do and what the buyer should expect. This talks about prorations. This will be escrow stuff. This talks about compensation to brokers and the broker's responsibility. This talks about representative capacity. You know, if somebody's signing on behalf of somebody else or an entity, that should be incorporated in the contract. There's a representative capacity disclosure form. Joint escrow instructions. This is basically just explaining that the offer serves as escrow instructions. In some states, you know, the contract could just be some basic terms, and then there needs to be separate escrow instructions that are going to spell out like the details. In California, the purchase agreement and the escrow instructions are the same document. Read all this stuff. Okay, these sections are important, and so I'm glad we got to them coming up against the clock here. But Remedies for buyer's breach of contract. This talks about liquidated damages. This is the section that if this isn't initials, then the basically the deposit like has no teeth. Like if the buyer doesn't agree to participate in liquidated damages, then they're not really like putting their deposit at risk. So that's why, you know, even though these are theoretically optional, it's pretty tough to get an offer accepted without this section and the next one attached, because it's going to make it, the buyer could just, you know, walk away or wreck the contract and not really have any consequences. So read this so you really understand it. But basically, when they initial this part, they're agreeing to participate in liquidated damages. And this is where it says, the amount retained shall be no more than 3% of the purchase price. One thing that's important is just because the buyer canceled, like you still have to prove there's damages. So if there's 20 offers on a property, you end up canceling under some sideways circumstance, they end up, you know, getting in a contract with one of the backup offers for just as much. It's hard for them to prove that there was damages because your buyer backed out. But, you know, your buyer backs out at the last minute, it ends up they're not able to sell the property, or they have to sell at a reduced price. Like they have a pretty good case for damages. But basically, they still need, it's not automatic. Here's your 3%, but it's a whole process. And this is the section, the clause in the contract that makes them both party to that agreement that, you know, liquidated damages could be a possibility. When you send a contract in through Zip Forms through DocuSign from Zip Forms, it makes this section and this next section that we're going to talk about optional. So it's important to know, and they make it optional because your buyer really needs to understand what they're signing there. And it's technically optional that they sign it. I always, as part of the first offer, I tell my clients like, hey, you know, I'm going to send you the signature. Technically, there's 2 clauses in the contract that are optional. It's hard to get an offer accepted without it. So, you know, you're going to need to sign it, and then I'll explain to them what it is. And as long as you explain to them what it is and they agree to sign it, then it's fine to just go in DocuSign and make it a required signature, because even if they plan on signing it, when there's optional signatures and people are just firing off DocuSign signatures, a lot of the times people will skip that. And then they'll send the offer, and then the listing agent will say, hey, you know, liquidated damages isn't initial, like it could be an issue. So just best standard practice should be explain it to your client, because you should be explaining, if you're going to explain anything in detail to them on this offer, these 2 paragraphs are sections that you need to explain in detail, and then go ahead and make them required signatures because they've already agreed to sign it. And so the next talks about dispute resolution. So it talks about arbitration and mediation. And basically by agreeing to this part is they're agreeing to, if there's a dispute, before everyone goes and starts suing each other, they're going to try to settle that dispute through arbitration and mediation. The mediator is typically like a retired attorney, and it's somebody that's going to go to, you know, the buyer and the seller. And I, unfortunately, and, you know, we're all good and my clients still love me and it has nothing to do with me, but I'm 7 years in participating in my first mediation on December 1st because of a crazy story that I'll talk about some other time, with a parcel that we didn't know about that someone's trying to build on right behind the seller's or this buyer's beautiful view of the Oakland Hills. But because both parties, as most people will, agreed to this part before they can sue each other, or even I think you can still sue them, but you still have to do this, is they're going to go through arbitration and mediation. And this section does not make the agent's party to arbitration and mediation. It just commits the buyer and the seller to go through it. But like in my circumstance, the seller and the buyer have been going back and forth for a long time. It's been over a year. And then now the buyers are suing they're trying to sue the seller, which in turn brings the listing agent into it. And now the listing agent is saying like, okay, we'll be party to the mediation and arbitration, but only if the buyer's agent broker is. So it was when I was with Climb, and luckily Climb has some good lawyers because they're part of a big company. So we're going to arbitration and mediation. But you know, it's one of those things that's going to come up eventually. So it's important that you understand it. And, you know, here I am dealing with it for the first time. So to make sure you really understand that those sections of the contract, because again, it's optional, but your buyers really do need to sign it. The rest of the stuff is pretty straightforward. I mean, I'll get to the last page real quick, but this is mostly just, it's going to get to definitions down here. And then the rest of it is just like, information. Time is of the essence. It's basically saying like everyone once there's in a contract, like everyone needs to act in good faith to move things along. Assignment here, you can't assign in California. You can't assign the contract without the permission of the seller. So in other areas, like people will get into contract to buy something. If you ever hear about wholesaling, this is what wholesalers do, is they'll get in a contract to buy a property at a really good deal. And then they'll find someone that'll pay a little bit more for that property. And then they'll assign that contract to do it, to buy it to them. And then they'll close them concurrently. And, they make a little bit of money because they have a contract for one price and they've assigned it for another price. In California, you can't do that unless, the seller agrees. So that's just explaining it here. It's funny because when I worked in title, you always knew when there were those like house flipping seminars or like how to make money in real estate. Those things you hear commercials for that make it sound super easy to make a ton of money in real estate investing, because literally like the Monday after a seminar, like 5 people would call the office, like looking for a title company that did assignments, but nobody really does. And a title company that, if somebody's using some weird random title or escrow company that you've never heard of and they insist on using this like tiny little company that's in another part of the state, it's probably because they're trying to do something shady, because title companies are huge and they're not going to bend rules and do weird things. Expiration of offer. This is where you're going to put when the offer is going to expire. It's important to understand this because sometimes you are going to be in a situation where you're going to want to shorten the expiration. By default, if you leave this blank, then it's the 3rd day of after the offer's signed that it expires, or you can shorten it. An example of when you shorten it, one, if you're just writing like a crazy aggressive offer and you want to just try to put some leverage on the buyer, like you can put a short time. Sometimes it's going to rub people the wrong way if you haven't like explained it properly. Normally, if I'm going to write a really tight expiration, I'll discuss it with a listing agent. I'll tell them, hey, like, we're going to put 24 hours on this, or we're going to have it expire tomorrow at noon, but it's because otherwise it just seems like you're trying to like press them. And unless you're really like, if you write that this offer is going to expire at 5 o'clock tomorrow, like, but you'd probably still take it if they called you at 7 o'clock and said, hey, well, actually we will take your offer. So if you're going to press the listing agent and the sellers with a tight timeline, you should have a good reason and you should communicate that to the listing agent. Otherwise it looks like you're just trying to like, take it or leave it kind of thing. And unless you really are going to leave it, then,
and if the buyer still wants to buy and the seller still wants to sell, this expiration date is kind of irrelevant. Like they can still move forward with the contract.
Yeah.
Sometimes you'll get sticklers that are like want an extension or something like that, but just know it's actually totally legit to move forward with the contract, even if after the expiration. But this expiration is in place to protect your buyer so that by the end of this time, they can write another offer on different properties. They're not supposed to be writing on multiple properties on the same day because it's acting in bad faith. So there's
because
the intent of getting this offer accepted. And then by the end of this expiration, if they have written another offer on another property, then they're protected at least.
Yeah. So, if you have offers due at, there's one due at 5 on a Tuesday and there's another one due at 3 on the Wednesday, you could have the one due the day before expire the day right before the other one's due. So when you submit it, you don't have 2 offers floating out there because the way the offer is structured, like once the seller signs it, it's essentially a contract. So if you have multiple floating out there, technically they're contract. So just to kind of get nuanced on that is technically it's not a contract until the sellers accepted it and then the buyers confirm that acceptance. So that's why on this copy of the signed offer is personally received by buyer or buyers. Normally you'd put in buyer's agent here because once they send it back to you, once you've received it, then that makes it a contract. We talked a lot when I got in detail on this is like, if they accept your offer and you like never send it to your buyer, and if you didn't put in buyer's agent and they accept your offer and you never send it to the buyer, like it's not technically a valid contract. So it's important to understand that part. And then this is just talking about, you know, this is where you sign it. You check this box if you're signing on behalf of someone else, like we talked about earlier. This is where you hope to see the seller's signature after you submit it. And then if this box is checked, then it's subject to the attached counteroffer. There's people will talk about, like, you know, normally when someone sends you a counteroffer, then they also include the RPA completely signed with this box checked. From what I understand and what I've been told is, even if a counteroffer on its own can still serve as a binding contract, but the reason that you want to see this is you might not know if you know, the seller agreed to arbitration and mediation. So if they just send you back a counteroffer and you sign it, and they send you the RPA and it doesn't have the seller checking the arbitration and mediation signed, then now you're in a contract where the seller's not committing to the arbitration mediation. So typically you want to see the RPA attached to the counteroffer when you receive it. And this is where the seller would sign if they're just straight up accepting. And then this is the confirmation of acceptance. So this is where when you get it back, you confirm that it's been received. This is where the broker's information is. This is where the escrow, this is when they talk about, like, page 10, when you get in, when you open escrow, this is something you need to complete your file. And it's the escrow holder acknowledging that they've received the contract. So a fully ratified, completely clean contract has all the buyer's signatures, the seller's signatures, the buyer's or buyer's agent confirming that they know about the acceptance, and then it has the broker's signature or the broker's or agent's signatures, and then it has the escrow holder acknowledging that they've received the contract and are, you know, the third party that's going to be processing it. Presentation of offer, you know, sometimes you'll get this signed. This is basically a way to, like, make the listing agents, like, prove to you that they presented the offer or rejected the offer. If you think a listing agent maybe is being shady and didn't present your offer, then ask for it, you know, ask for an officially rejected offer, because it's supposed to have the seller's signature on it, and then you can, you know, be confident that the seller did indeed receive your offer. That's it. That's RPA. You know, we cruised through a lot of stuff, but I think we really hit the main important parts, and hopefully kind of helped get you some confidence as far as explaining it. Obviously, reach out to any of us if you have questions, you know, on specific details, especially in situations where you're actually filling out a contract and your clients have questions or you're not sure how to explain something. But read the contract. I mean, read through it. And if you have questions after you read through it, let me know. But it's really, it's not as scary as it looks. Anyone got anything?
Awesome. So here's what I was thinking, John, and maybe we could talk about this in a lab. I think that if there's people on the line, obviously, that are brand new to the business and they've never created an RPA, maybe this should be a lab session, right? To where we have them pick a property, put together an RPA, and then send it to me, you and Karina, for review. And then we just go over those in the lab.
Yeah, totally. We can do that. I think we go through as lab as part of kind of the last class. We're all going to, like, write, and we're going to submit an offer, like, for real, like in a hypothetical situation. So we are going to be doing, like, practice offers, but we can find time to go through kind of one-on-one, like, because I want to do it like that because I want the offer to be packaged up with everything, like the cover letter written, you know, run comps, explain why you got the price that you did, because it'll kind of use a lot of the stuff we went through. But yeah, we can definitely go through this, you know, in a little more detail. But I think, you know, best thing to do is just read through it, and then, you know, anything that really stuck out to you that you didn't understand, reach out with questions, and we will schedule a lab. So I sent out something in Slack about labs yesterday. I kind of screwed up this week, and we kind of got away from me. So I'm not going to do an afternoon lab this week, but next week I'm going to start doing them in the afternoon. But for this week, we have one on Friday at 10 o'clock with Elias. he's going to go through some of the stuff we've been talking about last week. I think he's going to focus on setting up buyer tours. So for some a little more hands-on question and answer time, Friday at 10 o'clock, we're going to have a lab with Elias going through setting up buyer tours and you know, depending on how time goes, some of the other stuff that we've covered. Really, it's just we wanted to have the labs as an opportunity to give you time to kind of ask questions and get in a little more granular detail about the stuff we've gone over in the week before, because, you know, these sessions are just me talking to you for an hour and a half. So lab with Elias Friday at 10 o'clock, and then next week we'll have two. We'll have one with me on weekday afternoon, and then we'll have the Friday at 10 o'clock.
And I just put the Zoom link in for tomorrow. So I'll be ready to go. I'll have everything loaded up, and I'll show you exactly the buyer strategy and the buyer tour that we run right now. A lot of people have adopted this model. It works, it's consistent, it looks good, it's clean, it's sexy. So I'm looking forward to having everybody in the lab tomorrow. So 10 o'clock, the Zoom link is in there. And yeah, you guys know this contract like the back of your hand, because this is mostly what you're going to be working with for, you know, for a while is working with buyers. So absolutely love this, John.
Cool. Anyone got any input? Say something.
Yeah, John, do you have a link to the previous classes that have been recorded?
We do, yeah. I need to post last week's in Slack, and then the week before that was when I had one of the many weeks that I had some technical difficulties, and the first working with buyers didn't get recorded. But I'll drop the last week's in Slack, and then I recorded this one too, or I hope I did, dude. Pretty sure I recorded this one too. And okay, cool. And then I'll add these both to Slack too. And we're gonna find some way to, like, you know, organize it, and we'll have more, and we'll record the labs too. But yeah, I'll put it in Slack, and eventually we'll have somewhere that all that stuff lives.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Just quick reminder, I'm doing at 1 o'clock today. I've got a little Zoom thing with we hired a kind of media resource, you know, mortgage industry expert to talk about his predictions for the market to come. So that's at 1 o'clock. I posted in Slack a few times, but if you want to go to that, it's obviously going to be on Zoom at 1 o'clock. Just hit me up for the Zoom link. But yeah, that should be some insightful stuff. But yeah. Next week, we'll go through some of the more commonly used forms like addendums and counteroffers and requests for repairs and all that. But hopefully you got some value out of listening to me talk about the RPA for an hour.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Johnny boy. Have a great day, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow.
All right. Bye, everybody.